So, in a previous video, I described what to do with your emergency fund, that is, where to save it. If you've missed it, here's a link to the video. In short, I explained that your emergency fund needs two essential characteristics. First, it should be safe and not lose value. Second, your emergency fund should be easily accessible, that is, highly liquid. In light of these two requirements, a high interest savings account was the preferred method of keeping your emergency fund. Remember, you'll need to beat inflation in order to avoid having to top up your emergency fund every year. You may also need to adjust your emergency fund with changes in your lifestyle. Previously, however, I did not specifically discuss exactly how much money you should keep in your emergency fund. And the reason I haven't is because, you guessed it, there is no universally agreed right amount of emergency fund to keep. All you can find are guidelines, because the reality is that your emergency fund is a critical buffer for you and you only. Hence, above all, you need a tailored approach, and I will go into details on how you can determine what's right for you. I will also show you some strategies which will help you in case you need to use your emergency fund. More importantly, I will show you something better than an emergency fund, an emergency plan. An emergency fund is just part of the emergency plan. Best of all, you don't have to pay or take a course to find out, because something this critical should really be free. Right, enough waffling and let's get into it. What are those emergency fund guidelines mentioned earlier? Let's take a look at HSBC's recommendation. HSBC recommends a minimum of 3 months worth of expenses as an emergency fund, and ideally they say 6 months would be a safe buffer. The Money Helper website also recommends 3 months as a minimum. Vanguard and Experian's recommendation are between 3 to 6 months, and I have to agree with these. I personally think 3 months may be on the low side and more than 6 months may be on the high side. But again, these are very broad guidelines, and as emergency funds are all relative to your personal circumstances, if you've got the ability to bounce back from a dire situation fairly quickly, then you may be okay with a 3 months reserve. And the opposite is true. The essential thing here to stress is that you don't want to save too little or too much. If you save too little, you can find yourself in a bad situation where even your essential needs are not met. On the other hand, if you save too much, you'll be losing out on the potential to grow this money. This balance between minimum needs and opportunity cost is what ultimately determines the size of your emergency fund. But here's where I take a step back and argue that instead of having an emergency fund, what you really need is an emergency plan. And as I said earlier, your emergency fund forms part of the emergency plan, but there are other tools in your arsenal which you can use in case of an emergency. I personally have ditched the emergency fund approach to an emergency plan approach. This is because your emergency plan is broader, more resilient, and even helps you fine-tune how much reserves you need to keep. So, what does the emergency plan consist of? At the core of the plan is the emergency fund, of course, but we've already covered that. Let's jump onto the other elements. A key element of the plan is to reduce your expenses and cut out on non-essential spending. This means that you have to understand your budget and expenses on a month-to-month basis and have prioritized list of needs. Hence, low priority expenditure categories can be reduced or eliminated. This has a double effect of also making your emergency fund stretch further, because your spending has now reduced. For example, if you have an emergency fund worth of 3 months of living expenses, cutting your expenditure by half means your fund covers you for 6 months. So go over your expenses and see what could be reduced in case of emergency. For example, if you lose your jobs or there's a recession and you're a renter, you could go live with a friend, a relative, a girlfriend, boyfriend, or even move back with your parents until you can get back onto your feet. This could save you a lot of money and stretch your emergency fund a lot further. Another key element is strengthening your income side of things. Look for alternative sources of revenue during this period. This might mean taking up a part-time job or applying for benefits. It's worth pointing out that in normal circumstances, it's good to diversify your sources of income instead of relying on just one source, like most of us do. If you lose your job, which is your only source of income, then you will have to activate your emergency plan. Prevention is better than cure, as they say, so to avoid getting into those situations, see if there are other sources of revenue you can get. There are many things you can do. Investments yield dividends. If you own property, perhaps you could rent it out. You could be a live-in landlord, for example. If you're eligible for any tax benefits or tax reliefs, do use them. If you can have a side hustle, that's a good start. So there are quite a few things you can do if you think about it. But the nice thing with these emergency plan strategies is that they can be extremely powerful when stacked up. Because not only are you reducing your expenditure, but also potentially generating some form of income, meaning that your reserves get used at a much slower rate, if at all. The other element to the emergency plan is non-financial. Because not all emergencies are of a financial nature, but your emergency plan should cover for those as well. The nature of these emergencies are highly specific to you, so you may want to sit down and think, what could happen to me and my family and how do I prepare for that? As a recent example, the pandemic not only had an economic impact, but direct impact on people's lives. Unfortunately, in many places, there was a lack of basic needs such as food, water and other essentials. In the UK, we saw panic buying, which meant some people were left struggling. This situation is not necessarily resolved with money, and if you were trying to resolve it that way, your emergency fund would probably run out quickly. We do remember how the prices of many things went up during this period, like hand sanitizers. In this specific case, one solution would have been to keep a rolling stock of essentials such as flour, pasta, canned food, etc. Similar to your emergency fund, this stock should get you through such situations. Or you could go completely overboard and build yourself a doomsday bunker complete with air filters, power source and years worth of food and enough ammo to fight off the horde of zombies, of course. Just kidding, but you get the idea. The more independent you are, the better off you will be in case of an emergency. Imagine you have your own house with a garden full of fruits and vegetables. Your house is powered by solar panels, basically a complete off-grid setup. In that case, you may not even need to use your emergency fund at all. But obviously, this lifestyle is not for everyone. It does take some time to have all the elements of your emergency plan set up, but the sooner you start putting these pieces together, the more protected you are. So there you have it, a bulletproof emergency plan. This brings me to the end of this video. I hope you found this useful. As always, thank you for watching and see you next time.